this is stupid and you know it. I actually wrote a very ugly ebook about this. Boom, here I am. He did not pay me $100,000 to write that article. I wish he had. What's your selfish reason for doing this? You're paying me to do something. Is this legit though? They're talented, let's assume. That person could be my friend. Let's be honest with one another. I'm not going to share things. You would think that this would be not a problem. What are we trying to get done here? Either I understand your problem or I don't. If you want to be sassy about it, I think your public relations may or may not be kind of BS. So you should open an ice cream shop and sell ice cream outside the front door of your office. Stefan, you're supposed to be a strategist. I just want new revenue. You can drive new revenue in a variety of ways, even an ice cream parlor outside of your office. So that's my soapbox over there.
We're just going to jump straight into it.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about your content marketing philosophy and the impact that it can have on a business.
Absolutely. So to boil it down into one sentence, my big belief is that content is an employee, or more specifically, I describe it as a micro employee. So what I mean by that, especially when I'm talking to my clients as a freelance writer or editor, is constantly driving the question of what is this content supposed to do? Who is it for? Why is it for that person? What do you want someone to know, feel, or do when they're done consuming your content, whether that's reading, user-generated video, whatever it might be. So with that first part, content is an employee. That is how I see it, which means it needs a job description. And when you think about how that impacts a company, it's pretty simply that the best part about content being an employee is that it can work 24/7. The irritating part is that its capacity is widely varying. You know, with a human employee, you can kind of assume what you're going to get out of someone based on their experience level, time that they're willing to put in, things like that. A piece of content is one of those finicky employees where it has a job description, but it might just not do anything for you. Or you're going to have that one piece that does 99% of the work. So the impact on a business from a production standpoint is you need to focus a little more on quantity, although that depends, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But the other part is almost like the venture capital model, where you have to prep everything to be the winner, realizing that only 5 to 10% of them will actually win for you.
I like that. Now, how are you hedging your bets in that case?
Yeah, I like tracking toward revenue versus strictly focusing on funnels. So, I mean, funnels are really important within content marketing, but the way that I like to think about it is how can we up our chances of a win with some manual human effort? So what a tangible example is, if I'm working with a client and they're interested in building their brand presence, we could do that with a blog. That's an SEO longer play, and maybe a newsletter attached, some social media balancing on top of that. Or I could say, well, hey friends, you already have a sales force that's already emailing however many prospects a day. Is there a relevant piece of content that we can use to grease the wheels of a sale for everyone that you're already reaching out to? Can you apply some manual effort? I remember I interviewed one startup that talked about this as a key part of their content strategy, where they were so bootstrapped and had so few resources that all they did was make blogs that answered questions that people had during the sales process. So it was an entirely sales led, but then, you know, a prospect would say, and this company was in the moving space, like they helped people move across continents. And a potential client would be like, well, you know, what about international shipping fees? And so they'd make a blog of like how to handle international shipping fees when you're moving. And salespeople would send that out as an answer. And so in that way, the employment job description of that content actually was that of an assistant, of a sales assistant, rather than a standalone marketing employee. Or you can think about something like an ebook that is going to be used in an enterprise sales deal that is highly informative and is almost necessary to build a business case within large enterprises because they operate differently. So I could continue with multiple examples, but the general way that I like to do that to increase the chance of a content success is to think very clearly about what it actually needs to accomplish. So clearly define success. Is that revenue generation? Is that leads? Is that brand? And how do you measure it if it is brand? Because brand has a lot of valid measurements. And then think about how it can be a human companion, because then you're going to have the human inertia and the human effort that's already going into your business also accelerating your content, and vice versa, because content can make the job easier just as humans can make content's job easier, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And I've been talking to a handful of prospects lately, and a lot of the conversation we've been having is about optimizing closest to the money. And that's exactly what it sounds like this moving client was doing, maybe even inadvertently. Can you talk about how you have those conversations about that job? Like, and the reason I ask that, the reason I ask that is because we have quite a few in-house people who watch the show, and sometimes having those conversations with their management becomes very difficult, because management's concept of what content marketing is or could be is very different than what it actually is or could be. So talk about those conversations and what that looks like for you.
Absolutely. So I have a few different wedge questions that I like to ask. The first one, and this depends if you have some rapport. So, I mean, if you don't worry about it. But the first one I like to ask is, what's your selfish reason for doing this? Because if you ask people, oh, why do you do content? You will get some PR line of like, we want to add value, we want to differentiate, and I'm like, that's, fair enough. You do. I'm not saying you don't. But let's be honest with one another here. What do you actually care about? And that's when you start to get answers like, I want to be seen as an expert. Well, okay, that's a ghostwriting project, which is different than an open blog. Right. Or I want our community to lead our growth. Okay, that's maybe a UGC or something like that. So that's question number one, selfish reason. The other one that I like to ask is, what do you need to accomplish or see in order to feel justified spending money on this project? This works really cleanly for me as a freelancer because you're paying me to do something. So there is dollars attached to production. But within an employment context, you can, if you're in a position to do so, kind of subtly remind them that they do pay you to do this. Like, part of your salary dollars is being attributed to this action. What do you need to accomplish to feel like that was money well spent? The other question I like to ask is, say, regardless of content, what are we trying to get done here? And if someone just says revenue, because I've worked with people who are like, I want to make more money. It's like, okay, fine. So you should open an ice cream shop and sell ice cream outside the front door of your office. And I love that example because people get really hurt about it. And they will respond and be like, Stefan, you're supposed to be a strategist. This is stupid and you know it. And it's like, actually, it's not, because it accomplishes your goal of making money. And then, it really depends on rapport to be that sassy, but we'll see. But what I like it as an example, and you can remove all sass and sarcasm from the suggestion, is a really blunt reminder that revenue has parameters to it, that revenue has guardrails to it. And what you're really asking is, what are the guardrails of revenue? And perhaps the more company appropriate way to ask would be to talk about good and bad fit clients, for example. What types of customers do we want? Who is going to stick around? A really common example in SaaS, for example, is people saying, we don't just want new customers, we want customers that have a high likelihood that they're going to renew or grow with us. Okay, that's a different conversation than I just want new revenue, because you can drive new revenue in a variety of ways, even an ice cream parlor outside of your office. But when you start getting clearer on the parameters of that revenue, that's when you can start to use content. And then from there, the last question I like to ask is just a straight up, walk me through your current sales and marketing motion. What are you doing? And then what are either the sticking points or the obstacles or the problems or the failure points? And how could we possibly use content to alleviate that pain? So that's where that example comes up of the moving company. They're saying, oh, well, a lot of our sales die as soon as people start having tons of questions about this one thing, they lose confidence and they move on. Okay, well, if we can write a blog post or a series of blog posts to answer those concerns, we might get some SEO juice, but more specifically, we are alleviating a concern before someone says, you know what, I need to think about this, I'm going to back off. So that would be my rambly answer to that question.
No, it's perfect. And it goes back to what you were saying before about the manual power. What's the manual power there? If you're going through that process, you're finding those gaps and then saying, how can we distribute this further along the way? Something that stood out to me too is I just want to drive more revenue. I've had these conversations so many times as a consultant and then as the first time like going in-house. And it's funny, when I was my first real role freelancing was at cxl.com, and they did conversion optimization. And what Pep would say, Pep Laya, who was the founder over there, he would say, oh, he would ask, like, what is your goal? And people would say, oh, I want to improve conversions. And he's like, oh, well, if you want to improve conversions, just drop your price down to 1 cent.
Yeah.
It's the same idea, right?
The freebie that I did, it's wonderful.
Yeah. You have 100% conversion rate on that case. Okay, so I want to stand what do you need accomplish? What do you need to accomplish with this piece? That's one that I sort of put a little asterisk here on my notes. Dig into that a little bit more, that sort of question. And then this actually brings us to a perfect segue into the next section.
Yeah.
What is that process for finding out what you need to accomplish and then moving that forward into the next stages of production?
Oh, that's a fun one. So to think about what do you need to accomplish, I usually ask that on a project level. And what I'm really asking is what does this project do? What brick does it represent on the wall you are building? Or what milestone is this going to deliver that is a milestone on a bigger journey of the whole business? So to deconstruct that, to kind of reverse engineer it, I like to start with business goals. Like when I'm working with a new freelance client, I don't start with the project. I actually start with the individual I'm talking to, understanding who they are, what they're accountable for producing in their role. Because the other part too, little secret, whether freelancing or employment, if you can find a way to make your champion look good, you will get farther. You just will. I mean, we all want to be loved and accepted and praised, some more than others, but we all want it. So if you can give that to someone, keep that in the back of your mind. It's going to make you more successful and just make things easier for you. But anyway, I start with that person to get an understanding of who I am going to be working with. Sometimes that's all you need, because they will tell you exactly what they're accountable for and you can see a clear fit to your work. If that's not immediate, I jump up to the business. And I like to ask questions like, great, you're accountable for X. What does that mean in the context of the business? What's the business's goal that makes your required accountability valuable? Because different businesses need different things. Then I will think about jumping back down into the department or group or team that this champion is on. So I like to ask questions about the group itself. What is that group doing? But then also the interface. So if I'm talking to marketing, it's okay, well, what's your sales support mandate? Are you supporting sales at all? Or are you a different division that focuses on your thing? Or are you a marketing revenue organization? Do you do performance all the way down to the bottom line? Those types of questions that help me contextualize what's going on. Because if you want to think about what do you need to accomplish to justify spending money on this, or resources more broadly, it has to be this unique balance of moving the company forward, existing in its own success, and making the humans involved look good.
That's fantastic. What a great answer. And like, what what stands out to me about that, and you've asked, because we've worked together before,
Mhm.
you've asked me this question, and the answer isn't always so clear, right? For a lot of
Yeah.
for a lot of people who are managing the freelance work,
Yep.
the answer isn't clear because there's no clarity from the next step up or the next step up. It's content is a checkbox that needs to be
Yep.
checked instead of an actual strategic goal, right?
Yep.
There's a lot that I could unpack there. I do actually, I want to switch on that though for a second,
Sure.
because there is a way that we can talk about tie these two things together. I'm going to put it on you to tie these two things together, but
Sure.
do the content doing the job,
Yep.
how can we merge that with what we've talked about and how that all ladders up to each other? And then I'm going to do a really wonky transition here, and hopefully
Okay.
we can tie this together. And then how can we get freelancers to
Yep.
understand that goal and charge appropriately
Yep.
for meeting that goal? Does that make
Okay.
sense? Can we do that? I should
Huh.
diagram that question.
Yes. Okay. So the split questions. We got the content job description, and then we have the actual last mile execution, which
Yes.
may or may not involve freelancers. So job description is kind of everything I said in one document, explained differently. So the inputs you need to know are the overall business strategy, what the champion is accountable for, and what the team is part of. When you're talking about this job description, you can just write those business goals if you want a reference point. But the content version of that is information such as the audience. Who are we talking to? What do we need them to know, feel, or do when they're done consuming this content? From that's good at a strategy level. And then at the strategy level, you can also have the questions of what are the common obstacles? What's the sales pathway? Like I mentioned, what are the common questions we get? All of that. At an individual content level, then it becomes what I call a directional title. So it may or may not be the title you use in the end, but it should tell me as the author exactly what I need to write about. So that might be, for example, the directional title will be something like how to edit a YouTube video, parentheses, like practical step-by-step guide. Now, that actually doesn't sound like a terrible title from an SEO perspective, but at the very least, it gives me super clear instructions. What is the promise of this piece of content?
Mm-hmm.
And ideally, the next line should be an explanation of how it fits into the rest of those things. So, we need to write this article on editing a YouTube video, and it needs to be practical. We're talking to brand new YouTubers because we want them to trust us. Our selfish reason is that we want them to sign up for a free trial of our YouTube editing software. And then that, by offering this selfish reason at the end, it's very interesting. And this does link into the freelancer work, because you mentioned, how can I get freelancers to understand this? And I think that I might politely say that's the wrong question.
Okay.
I think the question for the company side is, how can I clearly explain what I want? And then the freelancer, it's incumbent on them to be the entrepreneurial thinker that is aware of your problems, and their job is to think about how their talent helps solve your problems, whether that's producing a completely finished thing for you, or at the very least doing their part of it if they're a specialist. So that's where that balance of what are you accountable for, the human in the room or the humans, what is the business looking for, and then what's the selfish reason, it becomes a clear piece where that blog about how to edit a YouTube video, if you provided that brief to a freelance writer, they would know it needs to be practical. So the tone is going to be pretty direct, pretty do this, don't do that. They would know that the ultimate goal is to get you to do a free trial. So frankly, part of the content should highlight how irritating it is to do this by yourself. It should tell you how, because that's the promise. But there's nothing wrong with a little editorializing that says, hey, look, this could take you 5 hours. There are solutions available. FYI, we're one of them. There are ways to produce that out, but you wouldn't know that that might be valuable unless you knew the selfish reason, because otherwise you're going to hand it to a freelancer who's going to say, great, my client wants to educate people on how to edit YouTube videos, and they're going to do that, and they're talented, let's assume, so it's going to be good. But you're going to read it as the client and go, something's missing here. And if you don't know your own selfish reason and you can't communicate that that's actually what you want, you might think that the freelancer messed up when in reality, they're just acting on the information you gave them. But at the same time, I will say in all my work with freelancers and any freelancers watching this, it is incumbent on you to ask those questions. Ask what that person is responsible for. Ask what the bigger company goals are. Ask what the department that person's in is responsible for doing as part of the overall goal. Keep those questions in mind too, because yes, your clients need to be self-aware, speaking to you lovely freelancers, but I'll be honest, most of them aren't. So ask the right questions from your side, have your base, so that you can start to say, look, either I understand your problem or I don't. And if you do understand the problem, reiterate it. And my favorite thing to do here, freelancers, and then I'll stop rambling, is I love to tell the person ahead of time that I am going to tell them my understanding of the problem, and I need them to either confirm or correct, so that anything you say, you're going to say, I believe that you are trying to get more people for your new YouTube video editing thing, and you're hoping to use content as a direct conversion driver. Am I right? Or if not, please correct me. And then they might say yes, or they might say, well, no, we actually want them to subscribe to our YouTube channel because that's how we really show them how the editing software works. And then you're like, we hadn't gotten there yet. I'm glad you told me. So companies, it's incumbent on you to be as self-aware as possible. Freelancers, it's incumbent on you to ask as many self-awareness inducing questions as possible.
I think what's great about that, and first of all, I want to ask, do you have a sort of like outline template or anything that you use to ask these questions?
I do. It's a system I made called the Wave.
Perfect. Look at that. So it'd be great if you could share that with us. But I think what's really interesting about this, and I'm a huge proponent of working with freelancers. I've always, every operation that I've ever built has been built mostly with freelancers. What's great about that is what you're encouraging is beyond just the transactional relationship of giving words, right?
Yep.
It's very consultative. And I wonder if you can dig into this a little bit, and then we have to talk about the pregame process.
Yep.
But what I think is interesting about that is freelancers often have a much wider scope of what's happening in an industry than in-house employees. In-house employees, God bless them, I've been there myself. You can get awfully myopic in the way that you view the content that you're creating in the market itself and where you stand and all of that. Talk to me a little bit about how a freelancer can bring that more consultative, worldly approach to those relationships and get more broaden the horizons, if you will, of the people that they're working with. What's the soft skills involved with that? And also, like, how can that play a role into pricing?
Oh, yes. Okay. Pricing. So it's interesting. It can be quite complicated. The soft skills have their complex moments, but for me, it is a simple foundation, and that foundation is human curiosity. Or if you want to be sassy about it, being a little bit nosy. Because everything that I'm saying, freelancers, you have to ask the right questions. Companies, you have to be self-aware. It's just based in, I want to know about you. I want to know the gritty, real side of you, because I think your public relations may or may not be kind of BS. And I want to know the real reasons. Now, the cool part is, as a freelancer, you're under non-disclosure. So I'm not going to share things. And that is a great protection for my clients, because I work with CEOs, I work with VPs. They might feel quite alone in their own company. They may not feel that they can share things with their employees, but they definitely can't share things publicly. And you have to respect that as an entrepreneur. So it's really cool, you know, that comment you made of moving away from transactional. I call that the old way of freelancing, where you're waiting for people to give you work. All you ask is, what do you want me to do? And then you do it and you hand it over. And that makes you a price taker, because then you have to base the price on word count, time in, whatever. And it makes you really vulnerable to having to spend a lot of time justifying your value versus focusing on someone else's value. Because the fundamental thing about freelancing, the equation, is understand a client's problems, explain how what you do helps them solve problems, and then they pay you to solve the problem. Money is the fuel to go from problem to solution, and your effort being the vehicle. Fuel is what makes your effort go. So when we think about how this translates to pricing, you can take, for example, writing, because as a freelance writer, it's tempting for people to say per hour or per word, because those feel concrete. But what I like to say is, look, I'm not just writing words down on a page, for a couple of reasons. One is that content is an employee, and therefore it needs to have a job description, and therefore it needs to do something. And that even translates to article length, because a 1,000 word article does something different than a 1,500, 2,000, 2,500, 10,000, all the way up. So when we think about pricing, it becomes, okay, I'm not actually just the person doing something for you. I'm your business partner, and in some levels, a strategist. I'm bringing in my vision across the board. You see your world, your whole world, but I see the entire world of this one discrete task that you're needing me to do. And from there, because I've asked everyone else of the 200 some odd companies I've worked with in my career the same questions, and they're all under NDA. So I'm not telling you anything, and I'm not telling them anything about you, but I can give you the distilled insight that will help me do what I call strategic execution. So yes, I'm writing an article for you, or yes, I'm editing, or yes, I'm managing a freelancer for you. But I'm doing it from the perspective of, how does my work connect to your company goals? And when that's done correctly, you make way more money than I will ever charge you. So, for example, I've got one client who messaged me a little while ago saying that a blog post I wrote for them was noticeable in closing a $100,000 deal. Now, I'm not saying that my blog post closed that deal for them. They had a lot of effort, relationship building. It was over time. But the one blog post that the salesperson shared was noticeable. The client remarked on how reading that blog post helped them understand, continued the conversations, and the team closed the deal. That's an amazing win for a freelance writer to be able to say that, because I promise you, he did not pay me $100,000 to write that article. I wish he had. But that's also where we get to that volume game that I explained at the beginning of this conversation, where, yeah, that blog won, but I'd probably written 24 blogs for this client, and the other ones maybe either had done nothing or done significantly less. So if you think about the totality of what they've paid me, yeah, they're still profiting. But it's, again, that VC style model where you have to invest in high quality across the board, because the big win will be enormous, but you can't expect everyone to win, even though you have to start out like they all will. Because if you don't do that, then none will.
Right. I totally get that. And something that, there are a couple things that stand out to me about that. The first one is that when it comes to pricing, and I've been huge on this lately, is that the content will outlive us all, right?
If it's done properly.
If it's done properly, the content will outlive us all. And by the time my contract's over, by the time my employment is over, by the time any of that's over, you own it. It's going to do its job. If it's doing its job, it's going to way make you way more money than I ever would, like, in this period of time. And I think that's something that needs to be taken into consideration, especially when you're taking this more consultative approach when it comes to all of that. Okay, we have to switch gears because we're at the half
Yeah,
hour
yeah.
mark already. The last question that I have, you've done all
Yep.
the work, you know the job of the piece, you write the piece,
Yep.
you go to edit. What's your
Yep.
pregame before you jump into the edit? You get that feedback from the client, and then we'll use that as a pathway to actually get into the edit.
So I actually wrote a very ugly ebook about this, which I will happily share because it's not gated or anything. But anyway, I will share that with you. But it's 5 levels for me. So I'll run through them pretty quickly, and if you want more detail, I'll happily share. The first one is a structural edit, which is for me about, does this content deliver on its promise? So a few things that I do is I'll only read the subheadings. Do the subheadings roughly make sense to the title? Then I'll read only the first sentence of each paragraph to make sure that it's skimmable, that kind of thing. The next is an SEO edit. So this is not just for keywords. That's one part of it. But the other things that can affect SEO is using the simplest possible words. So not dumbing down your writing, but using the simplest word to explain what you need to explain. Or I guess the other way to say it is use the correct word. Don't just use the fanciest word. Then it's things like removing passive voice and shortening super long sentences, which can affect readability and overall time on site, unless you very much need to do that, but there are only specific reasons. The third is what I call the verbal edit. If you read the entire piece out loud, what does it sound like? Does it feel like a natural sentence flow? And when you're doing that, you want to pay very conscious attention to punctuation. You know, a comma is a beat. A period, of course, is a hard stop. All of those conjunctions, semicolons, colons, things like that. When you speak, you say them differently. So be very conscious of that and see how it sounds to you, because if it sounds awful, it probably needs to be rewritten at least a little bit. We write and speak slightly differently, but it's a good way to help. The second is what I call the Control F edit, to cut what I've started calling lazy words, which are words that I've found are either you're not using the correct word, which means you're not getting the right structural edit, or you are filling for word count, or just simply being lazy in your sentences. And the words for me are that, your, actually, really, or adding to do before another verb. So it really does go fast. Just say it goes fast. The other one is deleting doubles. Sometimes you end up with double spaces, double punctuation, whatever, and any editing process errors. So as you go through with your other edits, you might realize that you've messed up a bullet list or not have a paragraph in the correct place, that kind of thing. Then the final edit is that eyeball polish. You're looking for consistency of language. If you say, team up front, are you saying team down below, unless you have a very conscious reason to change the term? And then the final skim, just for anything that is obviously out of line. So those are the 5: structural, SEO, verbal, Control F, and then the final skim.
Nice. And this is something I'm going to start asking all of our guests. Do you have any little rituals or state of minds that you like to be in before you edit? One of our guests, and this is where it comes from, one of our guests actually said before she edits, she does a whole read through while sitting on her hands, literally, not figuratively. So
what? Why?
Because she has to resist the urge to do line edits as she's reading through.
Oh, very fair. So for me, it is a reread of the brief or remind myself of the promise. So what is this article supposed to do? What is its job description? And then I can start editing.
Cool. All right. Let's hop into the edit itself.
Sure.
We've gone through all of this so far. As you're pulling your screen up here, I want to give a quick reminder to folks. Please check out the YouTube channel when you get the chance. We have the replays of all of the episodes there, as well as little clips and nuggets from each episode in very digestible bits. Lots of good stuff happening over on the YouTube channel. It's growing very fast, and we have some really great stuff happening there. Stefan, if you want to pull that up, there we go. Let's hop right into this.
Sharing now.
Yeah, we're good.
Beauty. Okay.
Timing on that was perfect. Super smooth.
Well, one does what one can. So how could I best help here. Now, I'm curious for your perspective, because you literally were my editor when we worked together.
Yeah.
Now the tables are turning and I'm editing someone else's piece. Would you like me to chat about this from a high level first, which is how I thought about it, or go into the line items and then get higher?
Let's talk about high level first,
Yeah,
then dig into it a little bit further. And
absolutely.
I want to preface this too with the first conversation that you and I had about this piece was
Yep.
that it's supposed to be website copy, but
Hmm.
it felt like a blog article. And if I had to guess, it was somebody who assigned a blogger a copywriting piece. Can you talk about that a little bit, and then we'll hop into the everything else?
Yes, absolutely. So I actually thought the exact same thing. When I started editing this, I was reading it as a blog post. And then I noticed at the top there, website copy. And I was like, huh, okay, cool. So the first thing that came to mind again is I try to remind myself of the promise. Now, this came to me without a brief beforehand or something like that. So I started to skim for the promise. And if I understood correctly, it seemed like the promise was understanding the Nature Steward program here, as well as the broader landscape of the nature steward and citizen science. So that's what I understood to be the promise of the piece, and that's something that is circumstantial to here. But going through the piece more chronologically is, the first thing here is this line: the world needs to step up for nature and there's much to do. I completely agree with that line. And I wrote a comment up here: I'm agreement, but that's almost the problem, because when you're introducing someone to a new piece, you want something that is going to make their brain trigger a conscious thought versus a passive thought. And simple agreement: you've said everything you need to say. Great. I don't need to read this piece. But if you want me to stay on this article, there has to be something that prompts me to continue. So I said, maybe a start in the middle kind of statement. And then as I continued to read, I actually found out that there was a great question here. So do you want to create a more environmentally sustainable world? If I say yes, then you've implied that the promise of the article is how to create one, or at the very least, discussing that topic. Because if I say no to that question, if I'm like, you know what, I'm not actually interested in that for whatever reason, then this article could still be of interest from a discussion perspective. Whether I'm trying to understand what you want to say or just trying to dunk on you, I'm still going to read the piece to get a sense of what argument you're making.
Right.
So that was the big piece for the intro: is welcome me in, versus this second piece. I even wrote the comment of, it feels more like a conclusion than an intro. It is necessary information. We've created the Future Stewards campaign, but I didn't understand what it was a solution for. And this is also actually a question that I love asking clients about content. And I say, what problem are you facing that you believe content is the solution for? And so I would ask the same question: what problem is going on that the Future Stewards campaign is the solution for? So that's a lot of the edits there. I did move that text back down to the bottom because I did think it was valuable. So that's the intro. Anything that you saw, Tommy, or do you want me to keep running through?
Keep going.
Right.
But what that talks about is that structural that we were talking about before, right? Like,
Yeah.
this makes more sense over here because you need to get that nod of agreement. Yes, this is the problem, or yes, I agree. Now let's start talking about the rest of everything else.
Absolutely. And there might even be room in this intro to offer some statistics and say, do you want to create an environmentally sustainable world? You're not alone. 90% of millennials want to do it, but they don't know how. That's why we created the Future Stewards campaign. So there can be a lot more, a little story going on there, rather than just boom, here I am, which is a way to enter an article, but maybe not an informational article.
Right.
Coming through here, I do like the Q&A structure, because if the promise is explaining the Nature Stewards and Future Stewards program, then this simple structure is good, because you are using, like I said, the correct words. You're not fluffing it up and burying the lead. The one more structural, or one more note here, is I don't actually know what a CVA is. I don't know that it's explained anywhere here. The interesting thing to note is, I'm not trying to dunk on this person for making that mistake. It's a really easy mistake to make when you only think about writing with your knowledge and the context of where this piece will be, because it's possible that this might be published on a website where the header says CVA and then explains what CVA stands for. However, as soon as you remove the article from context, then it can cause a lot of confusion. So that's where you want to make sure the content can stand on its own and tell its own story, even if it is removed from the context of its colleagues, quote unquote, any other blog post, or its digital home on the internet. Same idea with citizen science online. That read to me like a very custom term, and it is. If you scroll down, you realize that it is. Now, there might be an opportunity to hyperlink this to that section on the page, or maybe add a bit of a definition of citizen science or a plain language explanation. So if citizen science is the process of everyday people going into nature to learn, you might be able to say something like that. You can connect with nature through going outside into nature, which is citizen science, and maybe you put that into parentheses. So that's the comment from a copy perspective. Is this question, I think, is a great question in terms of the promise of this article. But I felt like the answer was written by someone who already knew the answer, as opposed to written for someone who is asking the question. And that goes back to audience and goes back to the know, feel, do question. What do you want someone to know, feel, or do when they're done with your content? And if the goal is for them to know what a nature steward is, there are a couple opportunities here where you're using language they may not understand. Same thing goes here. Oh, I made a spacing error. This is why we do a spacing error edit later on. But in here, what I liked is, yes, how does it work? But when you are asking the question, how does it work? What you're really asking is, how does it help me? What do I have to do? What am I going to get out of it? So that's why I suggested a relational tone, where you've got the information here. There's a trusted network. You supply the resources to help you take action, to make your actions count, all of those things. But I had to decipher that. I had to spend a lot of time doing that to understand how it works, rather than having the information really simply presented to me. And that speaks to a concept that works in both content and freelancing called cognitive load, which is a really fancy way of saying, how much does someone have to think before doing what you want them to do or knowing what you want them to know? And this answer, all of the information is there, but it is structured in a high cognitive load way, because I had to do a lot of thinking to pull that information out and say, okay, if I understand correctly, the program provides me resources and helps me take action. If that's the truth, if this is your content and you happen to be watching me right now, if that's true, say that and then offer more details later. And that would speak to that read the first sentence edit. Does that give you the instant good enough answer that reading further will give you all of the context and detail that you need? Continuing through here.
I want to stop you for a second there.
Yeah.
We've actually talked a lot about the shape of sentences and paragraphs.
You and I have too. Not even just.
Yeah. And it's really kind of interesting as it relates to the cognitive load. And then I just read recently that the average adult reader reads at 238 words per minute, which is insane when you think about it. But if you think about how long it takes sometimes to get through the first, opening paragraphs of a sentence or of a piece, or through a subheader or whatever, right? If you're not structuring those sentences and those paragraphs in a way that reduces that cognitive load, you're asking people to read so much.
Yeah.
And you might not actually there's not going to be a lot of retention about that because you're just trying to get to the good bits when you're reading.
Yep.
Anyways, I just wanted to point that out because it's a little fascinating statistic that I just came across.
No, absolutely. I love that. And it does continue too, where when you're consuming content really quickly, what you're really looking for is the what's in it for me, which is usually the promise of the content, because someone has self-selected into reading this content because they want the promise. They want you to answer the question. They want you to provide the information. So you have to do that in a way that is easy to digest, or at the very least, if you're adding friction, it's incredibly intentional and you know why you're doing it. Because sometimes friction can be a good thing. Sometimes using fancy words is part of your brand persona, but only if you know that, and everything else is as simple as possible. And that actually ties into the comment on brand persona, ties into this one. Is it for me? I didn't want to sound rude, but this does sound a little bit generic in the sense that if you want to grow, we will support you. That's amazing, and I believe that. There have no reason to believe that your group wouldn't provide that, but so do a lot of other groups, or at least a lot of other groups claim to do that. So my only feedback here would be to think about either what do you provide that no one else can, or what are the characteristics of a person that would love your thing versus someone else's thing. So what I instantly thought about was, from my understanding of this program, you're out in nature a lot. That's actually unique, because I could take a course on Udemy about sustainable futures where I never have to go outside. I'm sitting on my computer. Or I could do an environmental sustainability degree at a university and have to move to a different country potentially to take the right program. Whereas this program, by the sounds of it, from me reading this article, is pretty local. You have online resources delivered to you and supports to help you get outside. So if you're saying, is this for me, then it's more, who am I that I would love this? I'm someone who loves going outside. I'm someone who has access to nature, if that's required for this program, and I live in the middle of an urban jungle with very limited mobility. I may not be a good fit for this. And that's a good, just for this specifically, off of content. But thinking about who it's not a fit for can be just as impactful as thinking about who it is a fit for when it comes to this specific question. Going through, I want to zoom out a little and say, structurally, I really like how this is working so far, with an intro, some base questions, and then getting involved. I like that you have addressed the core information before asking people to take action, because that follows a very logical process. So A+ on that one. The edits that I made here were to just get some, again, visual cues. And this comes from that notion of reading headings only. The other thing I did is I used step instead of option. So the question, how do I get involved? There are multiple options, but I used the word step to engender this sense of continued engagement. And I rearranged them based on perceived ease. So step 1, exploring with citizen science, that felt very, poke around online, maybe go outside with a guide, very low commitment. Experience a one-off event was actually down here, and I moved it up because that felt next level. But again, one-off was really key, because I go to 1, so I'm committing a couple hours or a day, and then I can be done if I want. But I've gotten more engaged than simply exploring. And then I made step 3, becoming an ambassador, because that signaled to me an ongoing commitment, continued effort, and also continued expectation. So again, taking a cognitive load approach, my goals here were twofold. 1, make it really easy for someone to do something, because once someone does something, they're more likely to do more. But then 2, very subtly implant a psychological seed that it isn't only do one thing or only do all or whatever, but start and continue. So instead of someone saying, I'm here to explore, and then only ever exploring, I very subtly said, well, step one is to explore. And as soon as you're done with exploring, come to an event. That's step two. And then after you've been at an event, it's a natural progress to become an ambassador. And this is also, I started thinking from a business strategy perspective, is you almost don't want someone to jump to step three unless they're very, very serious, because that could lead to bad fit ambassadors who quit the program, who don't fulfill the actual obligation of an ambassador, and maybe don't embody the spirit of an ambassador that you might want. Particularly with this line here, they take stewardship to the next level. That to me is a very unique type of person, because there are going to be even environmentalists and nature lovers who are not willing to go to that next level with their efforts. And that's okay in a sense, but let them stick around at step one, or let them come to a couple one-off events before making a commitment and asking you as an organization to commit to them. Because every promise you're making of resources and time, you have to do if they sign up. So I very consciously said that it was step three, to add that intentional friction that if I were this organization, I'm not sure I would actually want someone to immediately become an ambassador unless they could kind of prove credentials, where maybe they're new to my organization, but they're not new to the broader concept of nature ambassadorship. So a couple notes there on that. Was a time when I added cognitive load back in, but also structured it to make it a little easier for the earliest and a little difficult for the most advanced levels, since that's hopefully a grouping that you might want. Now, if that's not your goal, remove this, call it options instead of steps.
I'm going to argue though for a second that you're not adding friction, you're reducing friction, because you're telling a story here, right? Step one, step two, step three. This is a story that's being told just in 3 subheaders, which like you get to self-select in that case, which that's how I'm interpreting it as I'm seeing it right now.
No, that's a valid point. I would only say it is, I wouldn't say it's increasing cognitive load. Maybe I spoke incorrectly, but it is introducing friction, because we as humans inherently understand that step three is after step one.
Yeah.
And so therefore the implication is you can't or shouldn't become an ambassador before you've explored citizen science. And that's friction we want because of our own goals that we talked about. So yeah, fair enough. I appreciate that. I think I maybe misspoke by saying it increases cognitive load. I do like the use of a picture. The only comment I have here is I wasn't entirely sure of the context, and I wonder if this might be a contextual design, where if I had seen this on a web page, it might make intuitive sense. But again, that is a note. I've mentioned it earlier, is think about how this might look without the accoutrement of your website. Because if that has nothing, then maybe all it needs is a caption below, just to explain it, so that someone skimming through might see it and be like, okay, that's a picture of a nature ambassador. I could be that person. That person could be my friend. The other note too is I'll say is impossible to know on a Google Doc, but I would add it anyway as alt text. Great for inclusion, great for accessibility, and great for SEO. So that's my soapbox over there. Then we get down into impact and initiatives. And I like this because from again, that zoomed out structural perspective, once I've started asking about how to get involved, I probably want to know if this community is legit. So the idea of having an impact thing here is quite good, I believe. I made this a bullet list for easy skimmability, and I added a note about community, where if you have a community story to tell, I always recommend you tell it. So in this situation, it might be like, 100 future stewards across the United States connect monthly, like something to that effect, if it exists. Don't lie, but I added it as a placeholder with the note. But I like the bullet list, because once I've thought, okay, step one, step two, step three, is this legit though? Just make it really quick, as opposed to asking me to read more. You're just asking me to look at more, which I think is a fair ask when you have an informational content. And then I did like at the end here, a lot more detail on the initiatives. I like that this was at the bottom because it does give two things. One, the person who is consciously reading is going to get down here. But two is the habit that some of us have, I know I do, of flick scrolling down to the bottom of the page just to see how long it is. And I like that if you flick scroll, you're instantly shown high value, in-depth content about what this group does, which might then prompt me to go back up to the top and actually read something. But if you're reading in depth anyway, then you're all good. I made some edits here primarily around ensuring that the first sentence after the header was a clear answer of what the program is. So in this case, I said, nature ambassadors support the delivery, blah, blah, blah. It clearly answers the question. And then I moved the other content down because it is valuable extra content. Same thing here. I added Nature Connect is all about XYZ because at the end of the day, this content didn't really answer that question. It provided additional context, but it did not tell me what it was. And then, seeing how they can benefit from initiatives. I like it. The only comment that I would add here for the initiatives is see if there's an opportunity to bring it up here. So what do they do or how does it work? Could be really easy to just say, for example, ... And then you might just say it in a line sentence, either with hyperlinks down, or at the very least, the reader who only gets that far knows that you have multiple initiatives at play rather than just being, for example, a brand new organization that hasn't done anything yet. You have the credibility of your past, so leverage it. I could keep going on a couple other things, but those are the high level. From a structural perspective, I like it, but I want to make sure that it grips the reader in a little more. From a copy perspective, I think the best comment I could make is be really conscious to write from the perspective of someone who doesn't know what they're doing rather than the perspective of the educated writer. And then from an individual copy is just doing that edit of, if someone only reads the headings, if someone only reads the first sentences, will they get what they need? Because we live in an era of skimmability, even for people with genuine interest. They're going to skim first and maybe bookmark it, email themselves, or go back and read it in that same session. But the skim is really critical.
Fantastic. And that brings us up to the final 2 minutes here. I would love it if you could just sum everything we just talked about, put it into a nice tiny little bow. What's the primary takeaways?
Right? Yeah, 1 hour and 2 minutes. All right. 1 hour
and 2 minutes, exactly.
That reminds me of a Canadian comedy show. This hour has 22 minutes. Anyway, the real core concept for me with content is to think about it like an employee. And I know that can feel weird to start, but I like that framing because it instantly starts asking the question, what's the job description? What's it accountable for? Who does it report to? Why does it exist? How do we justify the budget? And those key questions are going to inform so much development because the natural progression is, what is the business trying to accomplish? And then what's the department trying to accomplish? And then how does this individual piece of content zoom up all into that? That makes it a lot easier to work either internally and allocating resources, or working with freelancers, not just from a budget perspective, but also from the perspective of self-awareness to inform your freelancer on what they need to know to produce great content, which is namely your audience, what the piece needs to accomplish internally, the selfish goals, and what you want your audience to know, feel, or do when they're done consuming your content. After that, on the freelancer side, it's incumbent on you to start asking those questions because you, as freelancers, are entrepreneurs who provide solutions to your clients. And in order to provide solutions, you need to understand their problems and then understand how your actions can be the solution. That links into being able to charge more because you're no longer a price taker who's asking for work. You are a business partner. You are a thought leader and partner and consultant to your clients, doing what I like to call strategic execution. And then as we jumped into the editorial side of this, the really big questions to remember are you writing for an audience to learn something, do something, know something, and whatever that answer is, make sure that's how you edit your content. A first draft can be written from the perspective of an educated person writing for other educated people. However, the edited draft should have a really key understanding of the knowledge level of your audience and then the knowledge level you need to get them to, and making sure that you explain all of the context necessary baked into your article. It's a tall order, but it is absolutely doable if you think about skimmability from a headline perspective, the subheads only, or the first sentence of every paragraph, since that's often what people skim.
Fantastic. Stefan, thank you so much for coming on to the show tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, that's really it. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and have a great rest of the night.